Sustainability of Affordable Housing on December 11th, 2024. Thank you for coming. I am Senator Lindsay Port, Chair of the Senate Housing Committee and a member of the task force, and I want to thank you all for joining us. I would like to introduce our staff from the LCC, Evelyn Weiner and Mina Zhang, as well as our consultants from Management Analysis and Development, Sam Grant, Jenna Lane, and Katie Hatt. Our task force business today is to approve the November 22nd meeting minutes, discuss, review the agenda, and review the task force roadmap. So our first item is to approve the minutes from the November 20th meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed? The minutes are approved. Thank you. I would like to take just a moment to express my thanks and appreciation to each of you for serving on this task force. I am deeply impressed with the great ideas and the energy we're seeing through our work since the end of August. I would say, this is the second time I've worked on a task force with the folks from MAD and LCC that have done just an incredible job of taking a really, really broad and complicated subject and helping us narrow it down into real recommendations with meat on the bones that can actually help impact our industries across housing in a really impactful way. And so I appreciate all the hard work from staff that went into this, but also from you members who have brought those good ideas and those real stories of what you understand is happening in long-term affordability, and just really grateful for all of your work on that. We will move on to a review of the meeting agenda for today. First, we'll hear brief testimony on tenant perspectives from Andrea Brennan and Ellen Solly. Then we'll have a quick update on the final report and public testimony from Evelyn. And for the bulk of our meeting, we'll be walking through the draft recommendations as they currently stand following thoughtful feedback at our November 20th meeting and revision work that was done by representatives from each of the small groups. And then finally, we'll end with some brief time for small groups to check in together. The next slide contains our operating agreements we're using as a guide to our approach to working together at each meeting. I appreciate everyone committing to these and working together. And then next, here is the task force roadmap. As you can see from our workflow chart here, after today's meeting, we will only have 2 meetings in January, and the final report and recommendations are due to the legislature by February 1st. Do folks have questions on this? Great. We will now move to the presentation on tenant perspectives. Andrea and Ellen, thank you for presenting today. The floor is yours for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. Take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chair Port. I am Andrea Brennan, President and CEO of Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. I'm going to spend 1 minute just highlighting the data project. So this is something Family Housing Fund, Greater Minnesota Housing Fund commissioned to support the Minnesota Housing Stability Coalition. The purpose was to fully understand the current state of distressed regulated housing in Minnesota. There are 2 phases to this work. The first is qualitative interviews. That phase is done. An executive summary is on the task force website. The second phase is a quantitative analysis of operational data for projects, portfolios, and providers. That work is well underway and is expected to be completed at the end of January. the PowerPoint presentation summarizing this project is also on the website, so I encourage you to take a look at that. Just two quick high-level findings so far from this data work. One is that there in the current political or in the current environment generally, public policy goals for service provision in affordable housing are proving very difficult to achieve for most nonprofit providers. Second, nonprofit operators report higher levels of distress than for-profits. There are many reasons for that. All of those are detailed in the materials that you can find on the website. And what we hope to get out of both of these two data pieces, the qualitative and the quantitative, is one, a common understanding for regulated affordable housing stakeholders in Minnesota on the full scope of the distress and important nuances that we need to understand, and to use data and analytical insights to help design the right strategies that target the specific areas of distress. I mentioned Tom's study will be done at the end of January, and he will be preparing a webinar the end of January or early February to report more on the findings of that quantitative part. So thanks very much. I'm going to turn it over to Ellen.
Thanks, Andrea. Katie or Evelyn, are you showing the slides? Ah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I wanted to spend my time talking about what we learned from resident perspectives. Obviously, we all are doing this work to provide housing for people who need it. And their perspective in what it is like to be living in property that is experiencing distress is really important to helping us understand the totality of the issue. So I'm going to go through my slides pretty quickly in the interest of time. The first thing I wanted to talk about is our methodology. Next slide, please. We held 4 resident focus groups, and this represented a racially diverse group of residents in about 8 properties across our system. And then we also held 4 conversations with housing providers to share what we learned from resident perspectives and hear how they reacted and their sense of alignment around what those concerns were. And this report that is published on, I think, the LCC webpage highlights the lived experiences of the residents. Next slide. The one thing that we really took as a major theme was that our policy choices as policymakers and critical parts of that infrastructure is that these are demanding much more from our nonprofit partners, and the funding doesn't match. Andrea spoke a little bit about that in the qualitative report. The costs of providing the level of services does not match what the services are needed. And it's really quite clear that the residents are paying the price for this. Next slide. I want to just briefly mention the issue of coordinated entry came up repeatedly in our conversations with residents. And there's some information in our report about this, but this tenant spoke very specifically about the impact of coordinated entry and a housing first approach and what it meant for their livability. And I think that is a key area that we want to continue to explore. And so see the full report for more information about that perspective. Next slide. So there are 4 themes that we wanted to highlight. One is around safety, a second around cost that tenants experience. The third is around accountability in the property. And then the fourth is the impact of high staff turnover on residents. So I'll quickly go through those themes and what we heard. Next slide is around safety and security. And if you could hit the next slide on this one as well. One of the things that we wanted to share in the report is the tenants, their own words and how this impacted. So the key thing here is residents feel increasingly unsafe in and around their buildings, citing drug addiction and drug use as primary contributing factors to this. And you can see some of the direct quotes that we see or we heard from the residents in these focus groups and how it feels to live in that kind of environment. Next one, if we could go to the next slide, is around costs of living. And if you could hit the next slide to share the quotes. One of the things that we heard from residents is that the inflation and the lack of income through either stagnant wages or flat entitlement benefits make it really hard for residents to pay rent, which of course in turn impacts the rent collection of affordable housing providers. In short, tenants don't have enough money to afford their lives, and the affordable housing providers often pay for that as a result through decreased rent collections, and that has obviously an impact on the revenue for the building. Next one is around behavior of tenants, their neighbors. And one of the things that we heard from the residents specifically is that disruptive behavior from other residents, many who appear to not be getting supportive services, really creates a dynamic in the building that there's little or minimal accountability with other residents. And I think the key thing here is about the connection to services, and the tenants and the residents that we heard from in our focus groups made it clear the importance of support services in helping people adjust and manage and be successful in their housing. That was a very clear comment that we heard from the residents that we spoke to, and the importance of being able to provide the services in a way that matches the disruptive behavior or addresses the disruptive behavior that exists or that tenants are experiencing as neighbors. The fourth thing is around staff turnover and relationships. One of the things that residents highlighted is that the high staff turnover really impacts how residents interact with staff at a particular property. And while tenants and residents were quick to say that they understood why there was high turnover during this critical time, it did really for them undermine their ability to ask for and receive help. Specifically, it impacted relationships. As you know, relationships form over time, and if there is staff turnover, tenants and residents may feel disconnected from the support staff that is there, and it takes some time to nurture those relationships to get those back on track. So the tenants, residents heard and conveyed a high level of interest in having more community building, more direct connection with the staff. And we also heard from providers that they want that too. So the key elements of the discussions with the tenants were really also reflected in the comments on the section with what the property owners were experiencing as well. And I think that those are key elements for us to reflect on as we consider the implications of this. And so with that, I'll turn it back to the facilitators for additional discussion or questions.
Thank you both for presenting that. Do folks have questions that they'd like to ask Ellen and Andrea?
I'll just say a quick comment and thank Andrea and Ellen and all the residents that participated in this feedback. And just a reflection that this is kind of the why for this whole group. And it feels like at various junctures, we're diving into the details, and I think all of us internalize the why, but it's really good to sort of put this out there that we all have high expectations and want to have safe and affordable housing for our residents. And this underscores why all this work is so important.
And just to build on that point, Representative Howard, we heard that from the providers as well in the discussion. I focused in the interest of time to focus on the resident experience, but the report also highlights the direct alignment of housing providers wanting the same thing. So there's really no space between the resident perspective and what we heard from the housing providers in those conversations, and that is to be underscored as well.
That's a great point, Ellen. And I think, in the conversations we've had in this task force, I would say, none of these comments that you shared today really surprised me all that much, but really instead ground us in the real urgency of the work that we're doing today and how important it is that we move these recommendations, and also then that we act on them, both through legislative action, but also through continuing to raise this issue up to the top. So thank you so much for centering us on those tenant comments. I think it's a critical part of it. We will now be moving to a brief update from our LCC staff member, Evelyn, about the final report organization and timeline. Evelyn, go ahead.
Thank you, Senator Port. We're just going to do a quick overview of the final report table of contents today. As we looked at in that roadmap, we're going to be working on the recommendations a lot today, and then there's going to be a period of homework after this meeting until end of day Monday, where you will have an opportunity to refine those recommendations further in your small groups. And then after that, there will no longer be any small group refining of recommendations. It will all happen in the large group. After that homework has been submitted, I am going to work to have all of the recommendations in a similar format in the draft report and send that draft out to folks so they are able to read that over the holidays and come back January 8th with ideas and feedback on that draft report. So far, the table of contents looks like an executive summary, a chapter detailing the membership of the group, an overview of the task force, an overview of the testimonies that the task force has heard, an overview of each meeting that the task force had, and then going through the task force process. So detailing the mural exercises that we did and the Fist to 5 activities and those sorts of things. And then finally, there will be the recommendation section, which will summarize all of the recommendations that come out of this group, and then appendices with, appropriate additional information. Next slide. The other update that I have is about public testimony. We put that out following the last meeting, and we had one organization turn in public testimony. So the Metropolitan Consortium of Community Developers submitted public testimony, and that's written. It's about a page and a half, and it's on the LCC website. So we would urge you, as you're going through and refining recommendations further during this homework phase, to read through their public testimony and get their feedback on the recommendations. Are there any questions on either of those points? Okay, next slide. Yep, and this is just detailing, like I said, that the final draft of the final report should be available. I will send that out next week at the end of the week. We will also be working on the narrative statement through December and January, and Representative Howard is going to be leading that charge. And so if you have interest in engaging in that work, so far we have one volunteer, but we'd love to get a cross section of 3 to 5 members potentially to work on that with him. So please send him an email if you're interested in working on that. And I will hand it back.
Madam Chair, may I ask a question about the process?
Yes, of course.
Evelyn, for the second draft, will we be accepting comments on it as well?
The draft that we'll be working on through December.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so that first January meeting is designed for folks to come, and we're going to walk section through that draft report and get feedback on every section. So then in the final meeting, hopefully it can just be approving each section or making very small edits that don't require as much power behind them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Jesse.
Thanks. Is any part of the process still remaining to prioritize recommendations at all based on, perhaps impact, cost, those kinds of things?
I'm going to throw that question to Katie.
Thanks, Evelyn. Thanks for the question, Jesse. I think our hope would be to maybe have some opportunity for that at the next meeting. Some of it will be dependent on how soon we're able to get to general agreement on the recommendations and the wording. But I think we could try to incorporate something into the next meeting along those lines, consulting with the co-chairs and any other feedback that members would have.
All right, thank you. And now I will pass it over to Chair Howard.
All right, thank you, Chair Port. Now the fun part, the meat of the meeting, not that all of this isn't fun, but we're going to take some time to dive into the updated recommendations. And just a quick recap of how we've got here. We just keep making progress and molding the clay. And so we did this pulse check polling in the last meeting, and it had our small groups do a little more work on those recommendations. Some of the recommendations will look exactly the same, some will be updated. And then there was also some work where a representative from each of the small groups worked together to sort of figure out where those areas of overlap were, and refine the recommendations further. And a lot of those language recommendations are in the matrix document that will be posted here in the chat, and had been posted and emailed out yesterday. I would really encourage folks to use that document in this next process for the greater detail. Some of the recommendations still are quite expansive, and so not every word will be displayed on the screen, but you can use the matrix as a guide to see the full depth of discussion and what's included in those recommendations. And so we did pare down. I think we went from something like 25 recommendations to 17 recommendations based on some combining. And so what the goal is today is to go through these recommendations one by one and provide opportunity for the full task force to ask clarifying questions, raise concerns if you have them, so that we can sort of surface any issues with those recommendations and give our small groups one more opportunity at the refinement phase of this, so that we can be in a position in our subsequent meetings to take action. And so with our time, with 17 recommendations, that only gives us about 3 or 5 minutes per recommendation. And so what we'll strive to do is on some of these, maybe we sort of get a quick thumbs up and we don't have to spend much time. Some of these are more meaty than others. And so Chair Port and I will try to kind of manage through that so that we have time to get through a lot here. But the goal here is really to surface questions, concerns, clarifications with these recommendations so that we can, in the next phase, do that refinement and get closer to finalized recommendations that we can all feel good about and vote up or down in subsequent meetings. Are there any brief questions before we dive in? If not, let's go for it. So first, we'll go through administrative policies and tools recommendations, that group, and go through recommendations one by one here. And then each of these, what I'll do is we'll quickly have it up, and I'll just give a prompt, and please raise your hand function if you would like to ask a clarifying question, if you did have concerns or feedback that you wanted to share. If you feel like this is a great recommendation, we don't need to confirm that based on previous conversations. So some of these could go quicker than others. But the first policy we're going to look at is draft recommendation number 8. Close deals faster, review models, and identify opportunities for industry-wide processes and funding structures to get projects closed faster. Is there any clarifying questions or feedback for this one?
Representative Howard, this is Katie. I just wanted to note briefly with folks, we're starting with some of the shorter ones at the beginning. And so we won't be going in exact order, but having the matrix handy, I just posted the link to that in the chat, and that's the same document Evelyn sent yesterday. You can see on here, this is number 8, and then use the corresponding full matrix if you want to look at that for reference as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. We discussed kind of organizing these a little bit based on the 5-to-5 votes, and some of them that felt a little closer to consensus we organized in the beginning. And so that's sort of why we're jumping around a little bit. I don't see any hands on this one.
Representative Howard, if I could just recommend when you introduce each one, then rather than have us bounce back and forth, just say, hey, this is number 12 in this, so that when we reference the chat, because it sounds like you want us to put that in there with our comments, maybe just that we won't have to keep looking back and forth. if you don't mind.
Yeah, that works. And again, feel free to raise your hand or use the chat too. We'll move to draft recommendation number 9 from the administrative. And this is to allow owners to fund and collect revenue for asset management. And I'll let folks read the fuller description and give a second there. And then open for folks to raise their hand or put any questions in the chat. James.
Trying to find the raise hand button again. I'm good with both of them. It's just what I note here is that with the two items, they really could be separate, just so that we don't inadvertently, as we go through here, vote on one thing when people might have different thoughts on the two things. I like both of these two things, but one does not rely on the other. And there's a few of the other recommendations that are similar as we go through.
I really appreciate that recommendation or that flag because there's a few of these that are really expansive recommendations. And one of our goals is going to be form and function of each of these recommendations to look quite similar. And and so there is going to be work we have to do to organize that from a task force perspective. And for each of these, if there's a part of it that you sort of, I'm there on that one, but there's a part of it I have questions about, that's exactly what this exercise is for, to try to tease that out.
Thank you.
Not seeing any other hands. I think we can move to the next one. Draft recommendation number 10, which is retool underwriting standards to reflect current economic conditions. And I'll just give folks a few seconds to read the rest here.
And just a reminder to folks, as you're looking at these, we'd particularly like you to think about what is missing. Are there any concerns that you have? And is there anything that needs to be clarified? We're not, voting on whether we like this or not. We're just, trying to pull out, is this clear? Is there anything missing? Or do you have big concerns on it?
Any questions? Anybody on number 10? If not, we'll keep moving and.
Mai Chong?
Oh, yes.
Yep.
I think the only question I have is we just need to specify what that standard would look like in this one. Like, I think I agree with the general consensus on this, but or the sentiment of this, but it's just like, what are we using to measure our current economic conditions?
Is there someone that wrote this one that would want to just offer any sort of comments on that to the commissioner's question?
I can. This is Ellen. This was one of that came from the admin group. I think the reflection of current economic conditions really means to tie to the current indicators of what inflation is or what wages are. The underwriting assumptions aren't necessarily based on current market conditions. And so I think that's the intention behind this, is to really just look at the current data to better predict.
So that's feedback for the administrative group and maybe ways we could kind of look at a little more specificity or supporting material there. I'm just looking at James's comment in the chat.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, Ellen, is it maybe forward-looking as opposed to looking at historical. We can't always tell looking back what it's going to be going, but we know what will be happening going forward on something like taxes or insurance or some major expense like that.
So I just want to note in James' comment, for context, multiple entities have their own underwriting standards, including public entities, tax credit investors, and mortgage providers. I do wonder if part of this could be a recommendation for Minnesota Housing to, provide, if there's some sort of best practices piece, because it's a good comment that we don't control every entity. or the Minnesota Housing doesn't control every entity, but that could be a dynamic of this this one as well, to figure out our best ability to engage with some of the non-government entities that are involved in this too. All right, let's keep rolling. All right, draft recommendation number 11, reconsider incentivizing leverage of other public resources in the competitive funding of capital housing investments. This sort of leverage increases complexity by having to negotiate with multiple government funders, each of whom bring their own policy-driven requirements to a project. On this one, I might ask the writer to just briefly describe sort of the intent here, and what would be the hopeful impact.
Jesse, do you want to share from the group perspective?
Sure. So I think the really expected impact here is to simplify projects so there isn't a whole stack of people when one thing changes that you have to kind of negotiate with. For instance, what would be a good example of this? Ellen, do you have a good example? Like if something changed in the supportive housing requirements, then you have a whole stack of people to negotiate that same thing across the board with. And so it just ends up very complex when anything changes, when you go to recapitalize, that kind of thing.
I guess I'll ask a question. I would assume part of the thinking about incentivizing leverage of other public resources is to make public dollars stretch further, and invest in more projects or invest in projects that are closer to completion. And so I just question on any sort of potential unintended consequences or drawbacks for anybody. I'm just curious. When I see Nancy has her hand raised.
So I think an example of this for Center City is often enough the regs collide with each other. So we're in this situation where we have to meet one funder's obligations and requirements and another one. We just ran into that with the city of Duluth's home ARP money and coordinated entry, and Minnesota Housing's requirement that people high priority homeless go through coordinated entry. The restrictions disallow it, but we found a pathway to get there on that one. But throughout then the life of the project, we can sometimes have these competing and colliding regs that we're reporting on and having to manage through our intake process and all sorts of stuff. So that's how I read this. And but I also get the idea that having funding from the city of Duluth, for example, does show that there's support. And as a provider in Duluth, I also want to see that support. But sometimes it would be good to sort of review all the compliance before we get all stuck together for 30 or 40 years.
James and then Ellen.
Yeah, Representative Howard, the way you phrase that is correct. I mean, the idea is to stretch dollars across the field just as far as they can go, and with the different sometimes city or county or other regional affordable housing sources, they all end up colliding or sometimes not colliding in that way. What I might suggest here, and it could just be some wordsmithing around the language, is that it may not just be about the incentivizing, but actually how the funds are structured coming into projects. There was some good discussions probably about 10 years ago on the approach to that. Actually, I think, Ellen, it might have been before your time at Family Housing Fund or when you were just starting. And ways to do that they can really be more compatible, because I have seen where it works great and I've seen where it does not work great, bringing different funding sources together. So there is a there. It just might be a different approach to how we get to that solution.
Ellen.
Just quickly, 2 points to be made here. I think our group specifically focused on public resources. And I understand the challenge that the state is going to want to balance its resources to go the farthest, and the county and all these different public funders. But the bottom line is it's all public money in terms of how these projects are put together. And to Jesse's point, it takes longer to layer all of those. So I think a key phrase from my perspective here is the public resources component. And if we could take that broader view instead of thinking about it as just one funder's component. The second thing that I would say is, and I saw this in a number of recommendations throughout, and it's really highlighted in this one, is there are a number of recommendations that really focus around simplicity, making it easier. That's at the heart of what this recommendation is all about. And I think it's important for us to keep focusing on that as we're thinking about our recommendations moving forward.
All right, thank you for the discussion on that one. Yeah, just one final comment, and then we'll move on. I feel like something that gets at sort of aligning what the rules and regulations of all these public sources are is maybe some added language that could help us get to a similar endpoint too. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Insurance. The first one is to direct the Department of Commerce and Minnesota Housing Finance Agency to partner with affordable housing providers in the insurance industry to collect data on the state of the insurance market for affordable housing providers. Any questions? I'll leave a little time for folks to read. Any questions here? All right, I think this is when there were, we'll go to Ellen.
I guess less of a question, but more of a comment. I think it'd be really important, just like this committee and work was under a pretty aggressive time frame, given the urgency of this one. I think I'd love to see some time frame by which this report and submitted actions or suggested actions could be accomplished.
Really good flag on that one. Joe?
Yeah, I was going to mention also that I don't know if you talked about this before, but I think I think the Fed is also doing some data gathering and trying to get that might be able to dovetail with some of their work, so we're not duplicating efforts. I think we got a couple of the insurance guys here on the phone. They probably are on the line here. They probably are more familiar with what's going on there.
Yeah, we could add some pieces about kind of bringing in information.
Yeah. It's just worth making a note. We don't need to cover it here, but it's worth making a note, something to think about.
Sounds good. Let's move to the next one. Draft recommendation number 17, which is to direct the Department of Commerce to partner with MHFA, affordable housing providers in the insurance industry to assess the benefits, cost, and feasibility of state-based financial support to mitigate excessive insurance premium increases. Questions on this one? Not, we can keep moving.
Representative Howard.
Oh, yeah, Peter.
A technical item, but maybe it's direction to both agencies. So it's Commerce and Housing Finance to partner with affordable housing providers in the insurance industry, as opposed to just one agency and then having the other agency be a partner. But
yep, that's a good flag. On some of this, I always feel like someone's got to own something to make sure, but let's talk offline about that. Yep. Moving to financing tools. So this is a big one, and so maybe we'll spend a little bit of time on this recommendation. Because it has, I would say, like a recommendation and then some sub pieces that, to James's point earlier, could potentially stand on their own. And this is draft recommendation number 1 in financing, with the overall head: amend current QAP and other public funding RFPs by date to revise selection criteria structure. And then I'm going to give folks a minute. And maybe even we should just kind of go bullet by bullet. So the first bullet here is prioritize supportive housing and models with demonstrated success. 100% or majority public supportive housing. And then the second sentence here, until an evaluation is done on the effectiveness of the integrated PSH model, pause selection points for integrated PSH model. So there's a lot there on that one. And so let's just pause on this bullet and see if folks have clarifying questions, concerns, or comments.
Chair Howard.
Yes, Mr. John.
Yeah, for this one, speaking from Ramsey County, like this is not something that we would be supportive of in terms of eliminating this entirely without additional ways to ensure that there are going to be units online. So one idea that we had been discussing for another recommendation was about universal like vouchers instead, and that would help to address a lot of the concerns that we have heard from some of the affordable housing providers about those units being vacant and having to wait on coordinated entry.
Thanks for that feedback. I'll go to James in a second, but maybe I'll ask because this is one where the language changed and sort of combined a few things, and so probably warrants a little discussion on the why we're organizing it this way, from probably Andrea or somebody from the financing group.
I'm happy to jump in first and then welcome any members of my group to jump in as well. This is really important. And one of the reasons why it's really important is because we are seeing a serious shift in the appetite of investors and lenders and their willingness to invest in permanent supportive housing because of all the challenges that we've been discussing in this task force. We have not ever, to my knowledge, evaluated the integrated model to see how effective it is and if it's effective, especially vis-a-vis the more 100% supportive housing model. And so we think that by continuing on the current path of continuing to essentially require the integration of permanent supportive housing units in all affordable housing, most affordable housing developments, without adequately funding the services necessary for these units and these providers and the residents who live there to be successful, is continuing a pattern that is causing significant distress in the affordable housing community. That's why the first bullet was combined, is to emphasize that it's not walking away from or backing down or deprioritizing permanent supportive housing. In fact, it's lifting it up and it's saying continue to prioritize supportive housing in the models that are 100% supportive housing or majority supportive housing, where we know that those providers really exist for the purpose of providing deep, robust services to residents and have really deep track record of pulling together the myriad of funding sources necessary to provide those services. And so we wanted to combine those two, saying, yes, continue on the 100% supportive housing model, and let's pause on this integrated model until we better understand whether it's effective and or whether it's actually doing more harm than good. Because as we learned from the tenant engagement survey or the focus group, by promising services and not setting providers up to be successful in delivering them is actually causing harm. And again, we're not saying stop. We very intentionally use the word pause because we think that a pause is warranted given the given the condition and the distress that we're seeing in properties and among residents. So that is why we combined those two. And then I'm happy to speak to the other bullet points if there's questions on those.
Other questions on one? Before, I'll just make one comment that as I'm reading it, maybe we should be a little stronger. We sort of say until an evaluation is done. Maybe we should recommend that evaluation is done, because that piece seems like important information for all of us to sort of understand, the sort of effectiveness piece. So just a thought as we're thinking about it. James and then Scott.
Yeah, I'll be brief. This was a really good and robust discussion amongst our small group on this one. I'm very supportive of the concept of doing an evaluation, and certainly there are needs around funding. I have deep concern around the idea of pausing, just given the needs that we have in the unsheltered population. I think there's a range of things to consider in that particular item, and I do appreciate my cohorts and that small group with the robust discussion that we had. But I have concerns on the pause.
Scott.
Yeah, and so Andrea, thank you for that really good description. I also want to lift up Jesse's comment in the chat about the real challenges that permanent supportive housing providers have when it's scattered in terms of quality of services provided, and just stretching the limited resources is really thin. What I have a specific question about the second bullet point, and I think in our small cross group discussion that we had last week, I had asked this as well, and perhaps someone in the group can explain it. So the limit the required ratio of units restricted to households with incomes at or below 30% AMI to no more than 10% of the units. I'm curious about what exactly the situation or circumstances that's looking to address, especially if we're talking about pausing permanent supportive housing in kind of a scattered onesie-twosie way in other bullet points in here.
Yeah, who can speak to that?
I guess ultimately my question is, I'm just wondering if it's relevant given the other bullet points or not.
Scott, do you mean the second bullet point, the 30% AMI? Chris,
Yeah.
maybe you are the best position to speak to this one.
Yeah, I can jump in. This was provided by Twin Cities Housing Alliance. The feedback was the impact on going above 10% of all units for 30% AMI was having a more significant impact on the efficiency of the operation of the other 90% of the units, from an expense standpoint, from a turnover standpoint, from a rent standpoint. And that was ultimately causing more significant operating deficits to exist. I think even at 10%, it's causing some of those same issues. So that's where it came from, that going above 10% for certain case studies was causing more significant impacts to revenues and expenses, therefore NOI, and creating a bigger deficit for those properties that had more than 10%.
To Scott's question, is the first bullet point, like if we were to have a recommendation that involves pausing selection points for integrated model, would that in effect do what the second bullet point does?
Yes.
Okay. So that's helpful. And maybe we wouldn't need that level of specific, or we could use it in the annotated something or other as an example. Because I do think where we can, we need to strive to kind of condense the recommendations, form and function. And so that's good to surface that.
I agree with that.
All right. So we have two other bullet points here. Continue funding 100% PSH projects with only non-amortizing debt, and review pre-2020 projects for possible debt restructure. My one question here is, I don't know if we necessarily need a recommendation to continue something if it's already happening, but after the and, it feels like we're possibly looking at something that is doing something different. The writer of this one, have any sort of reflection on that question? Are we talking about two different things here, or how are they related?
I can jump in on this one. So originally the way that this came to our group in financing tools and programs was the continue word was not in there. It was fund 100% permanent supportive housing projects with only non-amortizing debt. So eliminate the amortizing first mortgage debt and review and so that was what the recommendation was. And James can speak more to this, but James was in our group and he said that, well, we've been doing that already since 2020. And so we didn't want to just disregard the recommendation. We wanted to reflect that what's currently happening. And so, and we also think it's important that we not lose sight of that conscious decision that was made at Minnesota Housing. We want to support that and support the continuance of that approach. And then also, so what about the projects that are pre-2020 that may have that amortizing debt? There is a need for review and potential modification of that. And James, I hope I did okay with that, but please chime in if I didn't.
Yeah, I'm with you because there are some older and not that older projects that do have required amortizing debt out there that it just makes it challenging for those projects. It's a good practice moving forward to continue with that policy wherever it works to not require or not include or amortizing debt on projects because it's problematic. So excellent job, Andrea. I'm with you.
Ellen.
Is this also an opportunity to provide some leadership for our other funders? Meaning, is this an important opportunity to highlight that the state isn't the only one that is driving the policy here, but encourage other underwriting, our other public partners to have this policy as well? Or is that irrelevant to this discussion?
Is there anyone that would?
Yeah, Ellen, I don't know the scale of what might be out there outside of Minnesota Housing's portfolio. We don't have many 100% permanent supportive housing projects left with amortizing funding, but if they are out there, I think it is a good practice going forward to consider that.
All right, and this last bullet actually, I think, is the evaluation essentially that's considered in the first bullet. MHFA responsible for an evaluation of the effectiveness of PSH development, integrated PSH, and 30% AMI units without designated services. And this one, we do have a date specific. Any questions on this one? If not, let's keep moving. Draft recommendation number 2, Minnesota Housing to develop a policy framework to support the sustainability of regulated affordable housing assets as a strategy distinct from new construction and the traditional approach of full recapitalization. I think I'll stop there and let folks read. Framework. So questions on or input on number 2?
Just because it pops in my head now versus when we were in our small group, probably Minnesota Housing in conjunction with other funders. I mean, maybe it's implied in there, but since we're not the only funder of preservation, just to make sure that we are coordinated on what that framework looks like.
Yeah, that's a good flag, and maybe just like calling out who should be part of the process to develop is a good idea, because it is not just, doesn't rest just with Minnesota Housing. All right, let's keep moving. Draft recommendation number 3, which is develop, revive, and or implement new and existing state strategies, tools, funding resources, and processes to address the small P preservation, i.e. stabilization, asset management. So, and then with some bullets here. comments on this one. I would just say from a wordsmithing perspective, I don't know if we want to, in our final recommendations, use this term small p preservation. I think better to probably just define it in a way, which we're working towards here. But that's just my only, it's more of a wordsmithing comment than a actionable one. And then I guess my only other comment on this one in particular is we're kind of light on specifics, which I think is okay. I just want to name that, and I think it's really appropriate for this task force to say we need to develop new ideas that include new resources. And so maybe that just makes sense to have that be a charge and a recommendation that comes as sort of a standalone piece here. But just naming that we're not sort of calling out specific programs or things like that in this recommendation. Ellen.
I think this incorporated some of the recommendations for the admin work group that we had earlier. And one of the points that we made in the admin work group was around process. So when I look at this, I think process is inferred, but we might want to be clear that this is also about creating a process so people know how to navigate all of these resources or these tools that are available. So I might just call that out.
Andrea.
Thank you. I do want to note that what's on the slide is not the full recommendation.
Well, right.
So if you refer to the matrix, there is a lot more specificity. So there are very specific programs that are named that fall into the revive and or implement. So it's not just go develop new tools, but it's look specifically at these tools, some of which are very newly created, like the community stabilization programs, recapitalization component.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. This one is really important to look at the grid where we have exactly that, some specifics. And so I just want to give folks a minute to pull that up if you don't have it handy. Yep, and we're calling out existing programs and tools as well. Nancy.
I think another one of our goals was to not have it just be looking at new things, that there's existing resources that we could could quickly receive money. If people wanted to give money to the asset management fund, it could easily take it and it could quickly get it out the door. So we were, I think, looking at that.
Super good point. And I think just right on, like where we have programs that exist that just frankly need more investment, like we should call that out, especially when we think about the sort of speed dynamic that we've all sort of wrestled with in ways that it is going to be quicker to invest in existing programs and create wholly new ones. All right, next one. Draft recommendation number 4, encourage the Minnesota legislature and local municipalities to enact policy changes that make it easier to build and preserve affordable homes, including land use and zoning reforms, process improvements to improve speed of development, and reducing or eliminating barriers such as rent control policies that have been detrimental to the development, sustainability, and preservation of affordable housing. On this one, I'll note I worked with our small group on this replaces a recommendation that was specifically about a state statute on preempting local governments on rent control, and aims to sort of broaden this and with more sort of encouraging language for the for the legislature and for local municipalities to enact pro-preservation and pro-production affordable housing policies. Questions or comments on draft recommendation number 4, which is, this one's a wholly new recommendation in terms of the language. And so want to provide time and space for anybody that has clarifying questions or comments.
I think my comment on this is if we could partner with this with a rent subsidy or other recommendation, I think for it as explicitly as possible, I think for our community members who see us on this task force and we're here to represent them, eliminating and taking out the possibility for rent control that can center them in the conversation without something explicitly saying that there's another recommendation to follow it. I just want to say that I struggle with that. I see it kind of in there, just doesn't feel as explicit as I think it could be.
I can jump in and provide a recommendation on that piece. I mean, my recommendation would be alongside this. I mean, if we're able to consider policy that does have a direct and significant impact on assessed values and therefore the tax base, that enhanced tax base can be utilized to facilitate enhanced direct subsidy and more 4D contracts to preserve affordable housing. That is kind of the direct connection to those two things. Right now in St. Paul, there's been a report that's going to get issued here. There's been about 1.6 billion of assessed value loss as a result of rent control. And that's not just impacting St. Paul. So that type of assessed value loss obviously then impacts the ability to have direct subsidy and 4D contracts. So on the flip side, having a policy that really lifts up the assessed values, not just in multifamily, but other sectors as well, which it would help facilitate, greatly help facilitate providing the tool at the state level and the county levels and the city levels of enhanced tax revenue that can then be utilized to provide more direct subsidy and more 4D contracts, which are very effective tools for preservation and support of the residents that need those supports. Right now, the rent control policy is a great detriment to our lowest income renters.
I'm going to go to Commissioner Zhang, but just want to first comment and really raise up what Shannon said, and I think it's right on. And Commissioner Zhang had mentioned, looking at, policies that support, vouchers, or I forget exactly the way, but, that's something for the first time the state invested in state-based housing vouchers this last session. And I do think it's the right thing to pair something like that in this recommendation. And we really need to be mindful, as Shannon mentioned, how these recommendations land with the folks that we're most concerned about supporting affordable, safe housing. And so I just appreciate that feedback. Commissioner Zhang.
Thank you, Chair Howard, and Shannon. I'm right there with you too. Speaking from like my time at St. Paul when I was a legislative aide, I know that before rent control or any of this, and before the pandemic, they did a study about like trying to do density bonuses, to encourage the development of adding more affordable units to market rate developments. And the finding was just always that St. Paul is not a hot market. And rent stabilization, it addresses the need for stability for tenants, and so that their rents don't go up so drastically that they can't anticipate costs. And on top of that, the ordinance still ensures a profit for them, and that there are exemptions. They can self-certify, and or they can talk about why their rent has to increase. And I would say that it's not just the rent stabilization that's been detrimental to St. Paul. It's just the case that St. Paul has always been a challenge, given that it's in Ramsey County where there's a ton of pollution. And in addition to that, it's because of worldwide pandemic and increase in building costs. So I would say that adding rent control policy here would be too early to even include. But we also need to look at the big picture of trying to serve those who have the least income.
Joe.
So a couple comments, and I'm going to be careful because this isn't just about rent control, but it's the hot button, and we could probably talk about this for days here. So I want to be a little bit careful, but I will make one comment, and I don't necessarily just agree with the comments that you just made, Commissioner. But that's a separate debate. But the problem for me is that until we start talking about the cost of housing and stop talking about rent, we won't solve a lot of these problems. And so we talk on and on. We saw some, evidence from Ellen and Andrea. We talk about this ad nauseum, and we know what's happening with expenses on insurance, on property taxes, on materials, on labor, on every part that impacts every part of our individual days, every one of us here, and every one of our customers, and every one of our residents in this state. And until we start talking about that cost and how we address, to the extent we can, that, whether that's through mitigating it through policy, incentives, direct subsidies, whatever you want to talk about, we're on the wrong track. We aren't going to solve this problem. We haven't been able to, and it's going to only get worse, in my view, if we don't stop talking about that. We know what the margin is our business. We know what the costs are in the business. And when you try to limit that, you push down and you impact other parts of the business, both the market rate, for profit, the nonprofit, heavily subsidized, every part of the market. So I'll happy to engage anyone offline. I've been doing this a long time in this space, and I'm happy to interact with you, show you what it looks like, show you what an actual P&L looks like on our side, on the NOAA side. And we don't operate all that different than nonprofits, frankly. It's very, very similar. The Class A, different function, but it's important that you think at least about, and that's what we're here to learn from each other. I've learned a lot listening to these arguments. I'd encourage you to think about that part of the discussion.
Chair Port.
Thank you. I actually sort of want to echo what Joe just said. I think Chair Howard and I have been having a 2-year now long discussion about land use and zoning reforms and what that actually looks like, and what, not just sort of the reasoning behind it, but the impact of it. And over and over and over, as we talk to developers, we are hearing that time is what increased costs the most. If they have a plan, if they have a project, and every time it gets slowed down, costs increase. And that is labor, it's supplies, it's just over and over and over. And I think like actually calling out that the end sentence there, the reducing or eliminating barriers, I would almost say reducing and eliminating barriers that increase costs, because I think like that is what we're actually trying to get at. It's all sorts of policies, and it can be different depending on what your community you're in. So rent control might be one of those, but it is only specific to a few communities. Whereas thinking about it sort of holistically as which of these pieces, which of these policies are creating new barriers by increasing the cost, which make these projects, frankly, unsustainable to do and make them very, very hard to complete. I think that is the key to what we're looking at as we are desperately trying to figure out how to build more units, and units across the board, including affordable housing and supportive housing. And, they're all tied together. So I appreciate you sort of honing in on that, Joe, because I think that is such a key piece in all of this.
I see Scott in the chat, and I might see if you could put a comment in the chat, because we've got about half the recommendations to go and some pretty meatier ones. Unless you have a quick comment, Scott. Otherwise, I
can make it really quick. I just want to I really appreciate this conversation. I think the holistic, what are the best ways to ensure that residents who are hurting right now are supported, and we continue to develop, go hand in hand. and it's complicated. And I just wanted to use Highland Bridge in St. Paul as an example of where market rate and affordable development go hand in hand. So the tax increment financing off those market rate units is an important funding source to fund the affordable at that site. And we have nearly 600 units of affordable housing that's currently indefinitely stalled because the market rate isn't moving, purportedly because of rent control. And so, again, there's a lot of nuance here, but I just wanted to make that point.
Let's move on. I really appreciate the discussion, and I think there's work to do to retool kind of some of the language here that reflects the feedback we just received. Draft recommendation number 5, another big one here in the financing. Take action to improve safety and security for residents of affordable housing developments, and include some specifics. And this recommendation, I think, replaces one that had less specifics, and I just want to call it and really appreciate the work of the team on this to identify, I think, some more actionable recommendations to help address public safety concerns. Questions on number 5 or input? If not, we can keep moving. Draft recommendation number 6, track key performance indicators related to the health of the affordable housing industry, with a few examples. And I'm just going to go myself to this one if we have a few. Yeah. So on this one, open it up. Questions or comments on number 6? Ellen.
Just a question. I think it's a great idea to have KPIs so we can better gauge and anticipate challenges in the market. But I wonder who's tasked with this responsibility, and I think it would be helpful to have the responsible party identified in the recommendation.
I was going to say the same thing. And it probably would be Minnesota Housing, or Minnesota Housing in partnership or with other folks. And so, I mean, I guess this will be one where the small group, I hopefully can kind of do some work to sort of add that clarity. All right, next one. Draft recommendation number 7, Minnesota Housing and other public lenders approve HUD FHA insured first mortgage projects as senior debt in publicly funded multifamily affordable housing projects. James, on this one.
Yeah, just a little bit of context. So the HUD insured mortgages are a really important part of the overall affordable housing ecosystem. Maybe in 2020, 2019, HUD had changed their form of subordination agreement that severely changed how they treat subordinate debt, both in Minnesota, particularly the way it affects us in Minnesota with our large deferred loans they own to projects. This is an active negotiation with HUD. We are close to a solution on this, so we want to get there, but it also requires HUD in partnership to treat debt coming from public sources in a fair way.
Anyone else on number 7? Andrea.
I was just going to ask whether, understanding that there's negotiations underway, it seems though that having this recommendation would be helpful in those in advancing this, because the negotiations have been underway for quite a long time, and this is an issue that reportedly is affecting not an insignificant number of potential affordable housing units in the state. So I don't know. I think it would be helpful to understand whether it would be harmful to include this recommendation, or from your perspective, James, just benign, since it's already under works, then maybe this could just reinforce and support the importance of this.
Yeah, I think we're actually very close on this one. I don't think it hurts to have it, provided it recognizes the important contributions the state of Minnesota has made towards projects and the importance of debt coming from the state of Minnesota into those projects. I just don't want it to inadvertently, which I do not think is the intent, but inadvertently lower the state of Minnesota's position and the way our debt is treated in that to get to a solution. But I think we're actually really close on this one, and that's good. It is good overall to have a solution in place.
All right, let's keep moving. When we're on to systems change, draft recommendation number 12, and this one is very expansive. And so we do have some work to do on how we're going to sort of position this in final form, but let's kind of maybe go through some of these bullet points. And this is basically just a bucket of supportive housing changes. I might ask actually the writer on this one to talk about how this all fits under one recommendation kind of broadly, and then we could kind of go bullet by bullet.
So Representative Howard, I'll start. This actually had many authors because this was across at least 3 groups, and it's very much a compilation. I think in simplest terms, this is about ensuring that what's currently a very fragmented, underfunded, supportive housing system. It's a kind of a menu of ideas and options to make it less fragmented and more fully funded. And so there's lots of different pieces within that, but I think in simplest terms, these 3 bullet points listed, that's what the focus is. If others want to elaborate, please do.
And again, please take a look at your matrix on this one. I guess we'll start the first bullet. Adequate service funding is paired with capital funding for permanent supportive housing units, both new and existing units. And then on the grid, there's a few bullets that provide kind of supporting examples there. Ellen.
I think one addition that I'd like to see added here, particularly on that first bullet point, is timing. It's paired at the same time as capital funding, right? So it's not just that it's committed, but when you're doing a deal and putting a deal together, you want that commitment up front. So I'd love to see that explicit language here.
That's good feedback.
Ellen, I think part of what we're thinking about too, and Scott, please hop in if I'm wrong, is that we're thinking about a separate funding stream directly for this. So being paired with something that is fully funding the supportive housing. And so thinking about a separate line item versus it being part of the deal. And so I don't know how we could be more explicit on that, but it's not so much as part of the housing. It was not part of the whole package as it generally is.
Could I just add a point of clarification? I wasn't suggesting it appear in the development budget and using housing resources to pay for services. I think that funding commitment from this other line that you're talking about, Shannon, can occur at the same time the housing deal is put together. So you get capital money and service money at the same time that matches the tenant needs that the developer is proposing to provide housing for. And I think that's another element in this recommendation, like the level of service need has to match, or the service dollars have to match the service need. And so the timing is what I was asking, not necessarily that it's directed out of the housing budget.
That's clear. Thank you.
Scott.
Yeah, and just to elaborate, the matrix has a lot more detail that I think gets at some of the nuances in here. The other thing I want to say is number 12 actually has 2 kind of really different but related concepts. One is the fragmented funding streams. The other one is a recommendation on coordinated entry that I think Shannon and Nancy and Jesse, I think some others may have been involved in writing that. So I'm wondering if one of you want to explain that piece that's really laid out in the matrix in detail.
Commissioner Zhang.
Thank you. Yes, for the coordinated entry piece, where it is hardest for our staff is to pair up the type of housing or the location to meet the need of the folks who are entering through our coordinated entry. So right now, our staff are doing this manually. So they are looking at a list on a spreadsheet of which units are available, what type of resources they offer, and then offering that to the folks who are waiting to get housed. And sometimes it's a match, sometimes it's not. And so this is all being done manually. So I would add to this is that we have a database or a system of some sort that our coordinated entry staff can use to help support this. And this will hopefully help to address the concerns that we've heard from our permanent supportive housing partners, where they're saying that, we are taking too long, like coordinated entry is taking too long, and that the units are sitting vacant.
A really good recommendation. I feel like that could be added or clarified with the kind of underlying bullet points.
I might be in the matrix. I got to double check because we talked about doing that and maybe utilizing 211 as a way of doing that. So I need to double check and make sure that it's in the deeper recommendations.
Just from my perspective, I think some of these could probably stand alone. They're separate ideas enough that they could be different recommendations versus kind of this mega recommendation. And in particular, I think it's valuable to have a standalone coordinated entry reform bullet point, so to speak. Because I think it warrants that level of focus to have kind of a standalone rec. Any other on coordinated entry, Ellen?
We talked earlier about kind of the preamble to this report, this idea of setting the stage. And when I look at this language on the supportive housing, I think there's so much of it that belongs also in that preamble about the landscape under which providers are operating and what tenants need. And I think that there's some great language that we can really underscore to set the stage for the report recommendations.
Sounds great. And also almost sounds like a little bit of a volunteer to help me out on the narrative work. So thanks, Ellen. All right. The third bullet, specifically the supportive services piece, is there anything else there on that third bullet? Jesse.
I mean, I just want to highlight that I think a big part of what the third bullet is sort of this conversation about how coordinated entry can have some way to match applicants more around what services are actually available or what the level of services are. So I really think that last paragraph kind of is an expansion of that last bullet. I think that prioritizing the highest need individuals through coordinated entry makes a lot of sense from a kind of ethical standpoint. And we want to have a way to match them to housing community service models that are prepared to meet their needs. And I think that's what's missing right now in coordinated entry is that housers there's no scoring of housing to match the acuity score, vulnerability index score of the potential tenant. And so I think that's what that last paragraph is getting at.
Anything further on number 12? If not, we'll keep moving. Number 13, and this is another one where having your grid handy for additional context is helpful. Regulatory changes to extended use period beyond year 15, LIHTC, HIB, etc. If resources are not sufficient to preserve or stabilize existing affordable housing, identify options to reduce the regulation on affordable housing during the extended use period to ensure affordable properties can be properly maintained and to extend their long-term viability. And there's additional context and recommendations for how to do that in the grid allowing flexibility in income rent restrictions, outline an efficient, time-sensitive process that responds to market conditions, such as utilizing a more robust and transparent ISG, explore the potential of income averaging. So there's a lot there. Are there clarifying questions or concerns or feedback on number 13? And actually, maybe on this one, if somebody would do a quick kind of what we're getting after here, what's the desired impact? I think that could be helpful for the group and for the public.
I'll take another shot at it, and I apologize for both this, the last one, and the next one. They're all kind of amalgamations of complicated, but I think really important recommendations. And so again, if there's questions, please ask. So this goes a little bit hand in hand with the preservation recommendation that we talked about earlier, and to the extent that after 15 years in a tax credit project, those projects really aren't designed to cash flow and continue to support themselves at the level of investment that those projects need. And so recapitalization dollars are available. Oftentimes those projects either don't score well or for whatever reason aren't able to get funding to help make sure that that they can be successful and continue to be strong buildings, assets, homes for the residents that live there. And so this is just a suggestion or a recommendation to look at the regulatory environment for projects after year 15, to if there isn't funding available to make those improvements that are necessary for the project, the building to be successful, that other regulatory changes are made, for instance, on levels of affordability where possible, the types of requirements around supportive housing where possible be implemented to ensure that the residents that live there are living in a good environment and a good building.
Can I ask a question on this one, which is a little bit about how this would practically look? So would there have to be an entity that decides that the resources are not sufficient? And then would that sort of kick in a potential suite of things? I'm just trying to think through how this could practically look.
Yeah, so I think in part it pairs with the next one with this ISG or expanded ISG concept. I think with a lot of these, there's Minnesota Housing clearly already does this, or our funders already clearly do this in some cases. But to create a really strong mechanism or body that's looking at these deals to make sure that there's guardrails to ensure that there's not enrichment from public resources happening, but B, to make sure that these affordable assets remain affordable as much as possible, but also just are remaining in good, sound condition and can operate successfully. We have, I think if you would poll the group of operators here, most of our portfolios that are over age 15 at this point post-pandemic really are underwater, and especially if they haven't been recapitalized. And so it's a mounting, growing, huge issue in the industry. And that's really what this is intended to get at, is to ensure, take some pressure off the industry to ensure that the industry can remain strong, but also the buildings, the homes that people live in remain in good shape.
That's helpful. Yeah, maybe it's through language, but the guardrail piece seems important, and capturing the responsibility of the housing providers themselves also. In some of this, I think we just got to make sure we get that piece right and think about the practical impacts. Commissioner Zhang.
Would this be necessary if there is already funding that's dedicated for preservation only, where projects such as these would be eligible to apply through that pool?
I'd put that to maybe Scott.
I'll take a first crack, but others, please jump in. So I think preservation dollars are important. Preservation dollars are already out there, especially for what we traditionally call recapitalizations. But they're not sufficient to cover the need. There's a growing need that far outstrips what's currently available publicly. And we think that the dollar amount to really get to a level that can fully fund it is probably higher than is going to be available anytime soon. So that's the reason for it, for when those other, that's big P, small p conversation on preservation, those resources aren't sufficient. What else can we do that is low cost, no cost to be able to ensure success of the industry?
Ellen, then Chris. Or did you have a follow-up, Commissioner Zhang? Or you're good? Okay. Ellen, then Chris.
My comment applies to this one as well as the next item. One of the things that I've heard repeatedly from developers who are experiencing this level of distress, they need a path and a clear path quickly. So what I would suggest in both of these is some, as a part of the process, some timeframes that in fact people can rely on a process by which a decision can be made or a path. One of the things that we've heard about a number of times is like projects are in limbo for a long period of time because there isn't a process to get out of the current state. So I think we have to recognize the critical nature of these two recommendations and ensure that timeliness is a factor.
Chris.
The only thing I'll state with this one is I know there's tremendous stress that does exist, that these properties are aging as they approach year 15, year 20 from a CapEx standpoint on a variety of fronts. So on that side of the equation, as we look at this type of provision, it does come with an added cost. And that's either through increasing the rent levels that are available to these properties, therefore for the lower income households, having them move somewhere else, or in the form of additional investment, and that's the preservation dollars. And I want to just note that on the other side of this, that's where I think the focus that we're having on the low cost, no cost solutions is critically important for all of this, because we need to offset some of these increased expenses that are driven by some of these solutions, which I don't disagree with increased revenue. And I think that is very much front and center in the news, that this is an important piece. So the public safety one that we went through earlier, certainly I know that's kind of one that can really enhance revenues in the form of tax revenue by having stronger public safety. And there's others that we've talked about that I won't get back into, but I just want to re-highlight this, that this is a solution that's going to come with a big expense tag tied to it, as are some others that really, as we look at the final package of these solutions, I think it's important that we have a pairing that is going to drive up tax revenue, because we need to have also then the increased tax revenue to cover some of these bigger expenses, which are worthwhile considerations.
James.
Yeah, I just thank you, Chair Howard, for recognizing the safeguards components of that. I think, just given the scope and scale of the need, keeping all these tools out there and what do regulations, and there's lots of legal and statutory considerations around that, including the state's investment in the housing that would still be there, even if there's not affordability requirements, or potentially still be there. So just really thinking about what those safeguards look like. We have a lot of fantastic actors in this task force that own housing and do a really, really great job. And we would want to make sure that others wouldn't use a provision like that to get out of provisions where they otherwise could actually still preserve the housing and retain it as affordable. I see a broader scope of sometimes owners that are out there that may not have the same good faith that is meant here with that group. And I know that's not intended, but hence the safeguards component being in there, just to protect the federal and state investment that goes into that housing and the long-term affordability.
Any further on number 13? We just have a couple left. We're getting there, folks. Next one. Let's go to the next one. Number 14. Another one where you're going to want to have your grid handy. Invest in the capacity of and grant authority to the Interagency Stabilization Group, or ISG, to collaborate among funders to support both big P and small p preservation needs. And some more specifics about how to do just that in the grid. Any clarifying questions, comments on number 14? It does feel like there's a lot of support for this kind of an idea that's sort of come up in many different ways, and so glad to see it. My only comment is a wordsmith thing, as I do think we've got to find a better way to do this big P, small p preservation thing in terms of how we end up with some final language. Jesse.
Just a clarification, when we say invest at the beginning, is it more investing in the group having capacity, or is it suggesting creating a new fund for ISGs or ISGs to manage?
Good question. I think it's more about capacity, but I want to send that to some of the folks that were working directly on it. James.
I was not the one working on it, so I don't know what their intent was, but I can note that ISG in and of itself does not have funding. It is a committee of different public and intermediaries. They're involved to help determine which is the best entity who could help a particular project, whether in the metro area or greater Minnesota. So in and of itself, there is no funding related to ISG today. Maybe it's been around for 25, 30 years, so maybe there was at some point in the past. Still very productive and smart group of people that help a lot of properties.
Other folks on draft recommendation 14.
So I guess I feel like if we're suggesting this ISG should have a unique funding stream, then we need to be more clear about that.
That's a good flag on how we lay it out. All right, I think this is our final recommendation, our next one. Draft recommendation 15. Increase funding for SAHA, which is State Affordable Housing Aid, to ensure counties' flexible funding to stabilize affordable housing based on local needs and priorities. Current resources are so limited, they have only marginal impact. And then the last piece here is revise the existing allocation of local affordable housing aid resources to only counties and cities of the first class, thereby alleviating fragmentation of the resources across so many jurisdictions. Feedback on 15. Looks like Mary has some proposed revisions here. And I will say, if folks can look in the chat, Mary is proposing, instead of saying to revise the existing allocation, to encourage or incentivize LAHA recipients to pool resources for projects to access preservation, thereby alleviating fragmentation of the resources in multiple funding applications across so many jurisdictions. I would say I very much support that. And I think I mentioned this last meeting, I would have concerns with revising the allocations where we're kind of taking resources away from some entities to give to others. And to me, Mary's recommendation is a good way to sort of talk about how do we maximize this resource, which I think is what's the intent of this revise the existing allocation. And so would just name that for myself. But are there other folks that have clarifying questions or feedback on number 15? If not, that was a lot of work we just did, and I want to pre-thank all of our staff that it was, I'm sure, working furiously to capture a lot of that. Before we go to next steps, I do want to just offer an opportunity for anyone that hasn't commented specifically, or if folks had just sort of brief reflections about overall, if there's something sort of missing that folks didn't see in here, a few minutes space for that. If not, I think that means we're doing a good job together. And in terms of our next steps for finalizing recommendations, our goal is to give work time to our small groups to kind of take this feedback, and we'll provide more sort of structured report backs of this conversation to you all. But we want to give an opportunity for small groups to take this conversation and make any sort of further refinements to the language or suggestions. One thing I think that we are going to have to sort of wrestle with is trying to have kind of form and function of these recommendations to look similar across. And so what that could look for some of these longer recommendations is just some wordsmithing where we have kind of an action-oriented recommendation that's one sentence with, maybe a few sentences of supporting information, and then making sure we have space in the report for this additional context. And there's ways that we can do that with sort of an appendix or what have you. And so I think our charge in our small groups are to, take this feedback, work on refinement, and work on, making some wordsmithing changes to kind of create some same form and function of these recommendations across each of the groups. And so you'll see some of in just the slide here, we're going to break out briefly into our small groups to just kind of game plan that, what work needs to happen. Does our group need to meet, or are we pretty close? We can do this over email? We'll just allow the small groups to do that check-in. And then the goal is by Monday, December 16th, to submit revised recommendations to Evelyn. Before we break, are there questions for the whole group that folks have about kind of the next steps?
I think the only thing I will add to that, Chair Howard, is that we, in your small groups today, really use the time, as Mike said, to game plan that out. Please schedule your time now if you are going to meet, or if you're going to do it by email. Monday the 16th is next Monday, so there's not a ton of time. So we really want folks to make sure that you are using this little bit of time today to figure out how you are going to update the recommendations based on the info that you will all receive from Evelyn based on today's conversations. Okay, we're going to break into small groups then.
Small groups for 10 minutes here, and then we'll wrap up after that.
Okay, it looks on my end that everyone is in a breakout room where they should be. Everyone. Yep.
Yeah, that looks terrific, Sam.
Remind me, just because some of the timing changed a little bit. We will bring them back at 11:55, correct? So they have 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'm trying to, how much do we even have? We might even be able to do like 11:58, like to give them a few more minutes. Evelyn, I'll defer to you. How much time would you like to pull everybody back?
I think that's fine, 11:58. There's not much to cover.
Okay.
Okay. They actually 11:57 will close them because it takes them, they get 60 seconds.
Perfect.
Katie, do you think we need to check in on them? I feel like we were crystal clear, but
Yeah, I think it's a shorter time, so let's just let them roll. with what they need.
Okay. And
They'll send somebody back out, I imagine, if they have a
right.
urgent question.
Okay. I'll give them a reminder when there's 5 minutes remaining.
Perfect. Evelyn, I think that I captured Nancy's edit from the chat sufficiently because I don't know how strike throughs are gonna, or like italics are gonna show up in the transcript. So I will send that to you separately so you have it for the.
Perfect. You're referring to Mary, right?
For Mary, yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. Thank you.
I'm actually very curious about that, Katie. So let me know if the transcript does edit text.
Yeah.
There, I know we're on live, but the transcript you download will include anything. I think there's no back communication on Zoom with presenters, correct? Otherwise, you have to edit that out. I learned that the very hard way. Meaning if someone like privately chats you and you download the history, it will pull that in because it will download you as the host. So I just want to hold that up.
Yep.
If we ever share those. Also, I hope, Jenna, you're like relaxing your hands and not doing anything right now. Don't even push unmute, right?
We're doing good. Doing lots of exercises.
I'm very impressed because, as I said, this would be a challenging topic to take it on because it's detail oriented and I don't know the scope of the context very well. Anyhow, well done. Right, I'm gonna close the rooms in a minute. First, I'm gonna get the slides back up. Then, oh, that's super interesting. Did you know you can share to the breakout rooms? What? That's mind-blowing. Sorry. Okay, I am going to close them and bring everyone back in. Everyone should see my slides, correct? Thumbs up.
Helps if I'm not on mute. Thank you all for a terrific meeting today. I'm really impressed that we got through all of those. I think it was incredibly helpful to have folks be able to plug in on the pieces that you worked on. And that is going to help people now as we refine this. Encourage you, if you have questions within your group on refining some of the things, to reach out to those folks who shared comments and engaged, so that we can move through this process effectively. A few closing details. So our next task force meeting is in 4 weeks on Wednesday, January 8th from 10 to noon. And your homework assignment, again, is to just coordinate with that small group members virtually, physically, over email, however you just decided, on any remaining work you have to revise the comments, the recommendation development worksheets. And again, Evelyn will be sending out the notes from today. So please use those to guide that conversation. And as mentioned, and I want to just like underline this and put it in bold, those worksheets are due no later than December 16th at 9 a.m. Please get those in on time. Our staff is working, LCC staff is working over the holidays to put these together, and we want to make sure that they have appropriate time to do that and also to enjoy their time with their family over the holidays. Other than that, thank you so much for all of your work. Does anyone have any final questions? All right. Enjoy the holidays and the snow we are getting. And we will see you guys at the next meeting in January. Thanks very much. We are adjourned.